Aristotle's Organon, a work of logic and metaphysics first transcribed 350 BC. The principal ideas of which are: of the categories substance, quality, quantity, relation, action, affection, place, time, position and state, substance is the most important, for the other categories are properties of substance. Primary substances are the subjects of properties. They are not themselves properties. For example, individual men are primary substances. Secondary substances are the classes of which primary substances are members. For example, the class man is a secondary substance. The propositional form, if all B is A and all C is B, then all C is A, is an axiom of logic by reference to which arguments of syllogistic form can be reduced and criticized. Scientific arguments depend upon ultimate premises established either by induction or by intuition. The 6 treatises that make up Aristotle's Organon are the first writings on logic as an independent discipline to appear in Western civilization. The title Organon has been used to refer to the collection since at least the 6th century, but there is no evidence that Aristotle himself referred to the treatise by this name. Aristotle's word for what today is called formal logic was analytics. Traditionally, the treatises have been ordered as follows: categories, on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and unsophistical refutations. This order is based on the contents. The categories treat of terms, the on interpretation treats of propositions, the prior analytics treats of syllogisms, the remaining 3 treat of kinds of argument, the posterior analytics treats of apodictic or necessary syllogisms, the topics treats of dialectical or debatable syllogisms, and the unsophistical refutations treats of unsound arguments, informal fallacies. However, Aristotle did not write the treatises in this order, and there is no evidence to support the rather common misconception that Aristotle regarded them, except for the prior and posterior analytics, as successive chapters in a systematic treatise on logic. The categories, topics, and sophistical refutations are early works. On interpretation was probably written some time later, and the 2 analytics were written last. The categories is perhaps as much a work on metaphysics as it is on logic. It has considerable historical significance, but its logical content is rather meagre. There was a wealth of material discussed in the 6 works, but it is of very uneven importance. Large portions are tedious and out of date, while the other sections are first-rate philosophy and surprisingly modern. Here a very brief summary of the contents of each treatise will be given, with following that a somewhat more detailed account of the categories and the 2 analytics. The Greek word kategoria, from which our word category is derived, ordinarily is used simply to mean predicate. The categories is concerned with the 10 ultimate kinds of predicates men and women can use in communicating with one another. There are references to the categories throughout the Aristotelian corpus, but at various places in his writings, Aristotle departs from the list given in the categories. These listed in the categories are substance, quality, quantity, relation, action, affection, place, time, position, and state. Aristotle specifies what he means by each and points out the peculiar characteristics of each one. This work has had considerable historical importance, which I shall return to shortly. On interpretation opens with some grammatical distinctions. Nouns, verbs, sentences, various kinds of propositions are characterized. The relations between various propositional forms are traced. The traditional square of opposition has its roots on interpretation. The four traditional A, E, I, and O forms of propositions are discussed, although the matter of the distribution of predicate terms is not raised. A, this is all S is P. E is no S is P. I is some S is P. And O, some S is not P. It is one of the more controversial treatises since it is the source of the view which has plagued philosophers, even those as gifted as Leibniz, that all propositions must finally be resolved into subject-predicate propositions, a view which modern logicians reject. The prior and posterior analytics are Aristotle's mature account of the formal theory of the syllogism and of what is today called scientific method. The topics concern itself with the dialectical syllogism, that is, with questions which are matters of opinions in the Platonic sense. The topics is an early work, probably its contents largely commonplaces from the Academy regarding questions which can profitably be debated. Aristotle offers common sense advice about how to attack or defend the various views uneducated Greek of 4th century Athens might expect to encounter. The work is rather tedious for the modern reader. Its significance lies in the seriousness with which Aristotle treats the problems the sophists offered to settle cheaply. It is also a reminder of the often forgotten fact that philosophy for the Greeks was a conversational business. To philosophize was to talk, not to reflect in private. Such a conception of philosophy as this undoubtedly led Aristotle to focus attention on the syllogism as the instrument of logical argument, since the syllogism is most effective and convincing in debate. The sophistical refutations, although an early work, has justly been held in high regard by philosophers in all periods. It is concerned with what are today called material fallacies. The fundamental distinction Aristotle draws between fallacies resulting from language and fallacies of relevance is still a common approach to the discussion of fallacies. Many of the fallacies he identified are still included in logic books, and called by the names he gave them, for example, amphibole and accent. Recent scholarship has shown that so-called traditional logic, although attributed to Aristotle, is actually a synthesis made in late antiquity of some Aristotelian doctrine together with elements from an independent Stoic logic. Stoic logic is now largely lost, but it did play into the rather crude misunderstanding of Aristotle that came to be known as traditional logic. Aristotle is the discoverer of the logic of propositional functions, the branch of logic in which the range of values for the variables traditional logic, the discoverer of the logic of propositional functions, the branch of logic in which the range of values for the variable is terms. I got it right. It's getting a bit dark in here. The Stoics discovered that logic. The Stoics discovered the logic of truth functions, or the propositional calculus, the branch of logic in which the range of values for the variables is propositions. The categorical syllogism is Aristotle's discovery. Modus ponens and hypothetical syllogism are discoveries made by the Stoics. The extent of Aristotle's influence, however, is indicated by the name hypothetical syllogism, which has been given to a Stoic inference from which is not syllogistic at all. The barrier traditional logic raises often prevents both a proper recognition of the Stoic achievements and a sound historical approach to and appreciation of Aristotle's syllogism. Aristotle's syllogistic, I should say. The 10 ultimate predicates Aristotle lists in the categories may be separated into two divisions, substance and the remaining 9. Substance is by far the most important. It is presupposed by all the others. They are really all characteristics of properties of substances. Characteristics or properties of substances. Within the broad category of substance, Aristotle distinguishes primary and secondary substance. Philosophers have often held that Aristotle's primary substance was the substratum of later metaphysics. Aristotle himself says that it is neither predicable of nor present in a subject, and he lists as examples the individual man or the individual horse. Secondary substances are the species of which primary substances are members. Man and horse, for example, are illustrations of secondary substances. We might get closer to Aristotle's doctrine if we recognize that practically everything he means by substances could be included if we talked merely about that which is symbolized by whatever word may stand as the subject of a proposition. But it would be going beyond the doctrine of the categories to charge Aristotle with the substratum view of primary substance. Actually, Aristotle seems to mean by primary substance merely the common sense notion of a living, individual thing. After all, the term thing is metaphysically vague, and its mere occurrence in a passage is not sufficient ground for inferring that Aristotle held a substratum doctrine. Examination of the words predicable of and present in a subject reveals insufficient support for a substratum view. The remarks Aristotle makes immediately following the distinction between primary and secondary substance, so that by predicable of he means the relation between a genus or species and one of its members. For example, the species man is predicable of the substance, Socrates, while present in refers to the relation between a substance and one of its attributes. For example, the attribute rational is present in the substance Socrates. Before dispensing with this question, however, we should note a remark which Aristotle makes shortly following the section discussed above. He states that primary substances are most properly called substances as a result of the fact that they are entities which underlie everything else, and that everything else is predicated of or present in them. In another place he states that primary substances are called primary because they underlie and are the subjects of everything else. Now, although underlies immediately suggests substratum, it is important to bear in mind that the substratum doctrine was not fully developed until the medieval period. long after Aristotle's death. We should beware of anachronism and avoid attributing to Aristotle a view which was not current until after his time. If nothing is attributed to him which cannot be supported by the statements he makes in the categories, it is clear that he does not dare hold such a view, for the words present in and predicable of do not by themselves entail a substratum view, and underlie and are subjects of are words which show that Aristotle treats underlie as equivalent in meaning to our subjects. It would therefore seem wiser to recognize that there is not sufficient evidence to support the view that the category set forth a substratum view. What Aristotle had in mind when he spoke about primary substances was simply individual living things without the metaphysical and epistemological frills which decorate the substratum doctrine. Considerable interest has developed in Aristotle's syllogistic as it is presented in the prior analytics. Viewed on its own merits, apart from the additions and revisions of traditional logic, the doctrine of the prior analytics is seen to be surprisingly modern and innocent of many of the charges often made against it. It lacks the refinement of contemporary functional calculi, but it nevertheless is a surprisingly sophisticated formal axiomatic system, needing but little to make it a completely acceptable logical calculus. A modern logical calculus includes 4 elements. 1. A set of terms which are undefined within the calculus or primitive, and which serve as a basis for defining all other terms in the system. Examples of such primitive terms in a logical calculus are not and if, or not and if then, and the notion of the variable. 2. Formation rules which specify which expressions are to be included as well-formed and which expressions are inappropriate or not well-formed. For example, we all recognize implicitly that the instructor is tardy is a sensible English sentence, while the stone sang a solo is inappropriate or not well-formed. The formation rules explicitly state the condition well-formed expressions must meet. 3. Certain axioms or postulates from which the theorems of the system are derived. Euclid's axioms that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line is an example, taken from geometry rather than logic, of course, of an unproven axiom. A set of rules specifying how the theorems are to be derived. This is 4, by the way. A set of rules specifying how the theorems are to be derived from the axioms. Aristotle does not call his primitive terms by that name, but he uses not and if then as primitives, taking it for granted that the reader can also use them and offering no definitions for them. In the case of variables, however, he has clearly and self-consciously arrived at the modern point of view. Throughout the prior analytics he uses letters of the alphabet in stating his syllogistic forms, and only after stating them formally does he give examples of terms which can be substituted for the variables. For examples, he discusses syllogistic forms of the first figure using the letters A, B and C, and then often lists terms which can be taken as values for these variables. Terms such as horse, man, and animal. The prior analytics does not include any specific formation rules, since Aristotle presupposed that he and his readers were able to recognize well-formed expressions and to rule out inappropriate expressions. He did not recognize the theoretical importance of such rules. nor did he include explicitly stated inference rules for passing from axiom to theorems. However, a great number of proofs appear in the course of the treatise, and the proof techniques which are appropriate for deriving the theorems from the axioms are given names. Thus Aristotle illustrated the rules of proof, even though he did not lay them down as a modern logician would. The axioms are the valid moods of figure 1, and the theorems are the valid moods of the other figures. The proof techniques are the techniques of reduction, and Aristotle makes it clear that all valid moods in the second and third figures can be derived from figure 1 either by conversion, later called direct reduction by logicians, or by reductio per impossible, later called indirect reduction by logicians. The axiomatic character of the prior analytics is what is most often overlooked by contemporary logicians and scholars. Aristotle is usually credited with the well-known syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The form known as Barbara, figure 1, mood AAA, is also usually attributed to Aristotle. However, neither of these is to be found in Aristotle. He did write about something which resembles these traditional forms, but it was quite different theoretically. Compare the traditional form of Barbara with Aristotle's form. The traditional form of Barbara is all M is P, all S is M, therefore all S is P. Aristotle's form is if all B is A and all C is B, then all C is A. Barbara is an inference rule. It justifies asserting the conclusion on the basis of two premises. There are three propositional forms in Barbara, together with the special word or symbol therefore, the sign or mark of an inference. Aristotle's form, however, has only one proposition and no word therefore. It is a propositional form, not a rule of inference. Aristotle's form is really an axiom, one of four which correspond to the four valid moods of the first figure in the same way that the two forms just mentioned correspond. As axioms, then, in Aristotle's axiomatic syllogistic, there are propositions corresponding to the four valid moods of figure 1. As theorems derived by reduction, there are the valid moods of figures 2 and 3. There is one additional point which should be made about Aristotle's axioms, however. Contemporary logicians do not try to establish the truth of their axioms. They merely assume them and deduce their consequences. Aristotle tried to justify his axioms by appealing to the dictum de omne nullo. This was his definition of the first figure. Aristotle regarded the dictum as self-evidently true, and he said that the first figure which he defined was the perfect figure. The dictum as the definition of the first figure leads to the last point to be made here about the doctrine of prior analytics. As is commonly known, Aristotle, as is commonly known, recognized only the first three figures. He has sometimes been charged with error here, but as he defined the figures, there are only three. The basis for his division is the width of the middle term. If the middle term is predicated of both the major and the minor, the syllogism is second figure. If the major and the minor are both predicated of the middle, the syllogism is a third figure. If the middle is predicated of one extreme, while the other extreme is predicated of the middle term, the syllogism is the first figure. These exhaust the possibilities, of course, and the last definition includes both the traditional first and fourth figures. In fact, Aristotle did recognise and list the valid moods of the fourth figure, even though he somewhat uncomfortably treated them as strange first figure moods. We now turn briefly to the posterior analytics, Aristotle's account of scientific method. There are two features of scientific knowledge which Aristotle stresses: its factual character and its necessary character. To know something for Aristotle meant knowing that an event occurred, and it meant knowing the cause of the event. This is the factual character. In addition, scientific propositions cannot be false. They are not merely contingently true. This is the necessary character of such knowledge. For Aristotle, then, science consists of a series of propositions which are logically systematic, have factual reference, and are necessarily true. What gives the collection of propositions logical order is, of course, the syllogism. Scientific propositions are syllogistically demonstrated, conclusions from true premises. But the premises must also have been demonstrated, otherwise the conclusion is merely consistent, not necessarily true. However, it is obvious that not all premises can be syllogistically demonstrated. Ultimately, the regressive demonstrations must come to an end. At this point, one has reached premises which must be justified in another manner. Aristotle offers a justification for such first premises, and this justification is the most fascinating part of the posterior analytics. Aristotle lists 6 characteristics of ultimate premises. Ultimate premises: 1. Must be true propositions about things which exist, matters of fact. 2. They must be primary, by which Aristotle means logically indemonstrable. 3. They must be immediate, that is, they must be self-evident. 4. They must be better known than the conclusions which follow from them. 5. They must be prior to the conclusions in a logical sense. 6. They must state the causes of the events referred to by the conclusions. Aristotle mentions 2 methods of establishing such ultimate premises: induction and intuition. The induction he is speaking about in the posterior analytics, however, is perfect induction, and so the question ultimately turns on the account of intuition. At the very end of the posterior analytics, Aristotle describes intuition as a process involving the following steps. 1. Sense perception. 2. Retention of the sense percept in the soul, following the removal of the external stimulus. 3. Memory. I forgot where that was there for a moment. 4. How to cover a mistake up with a joke anyway. 4. Experience is the product of repeated memories. 5. Abstraction of the universal, the one in the many, from experience. Here we see, however, that the justification of the first premises has led to the problem of the role played by the active intellect, a matter which is more fully, though not completely, satisfactorily dealt with in Aristotle's Psychology, his treatise on the soul, which I have covered already. This brief survey should make it clear that Aristotle's claim to the title Father of Logic is, after all, a just one. He marked out many of the problems of logic and offered solutions which, in many cases, retain even today their fascination and pertinence. Now, of course, he made mistakes, and his system of logic is incomplete by modern standards, but he closes the Organon with the comment that there was nothing written on the subject before him. He then asks to be excused for his mistakes, but thanked for the light he has shed on the matter. Western civilization is deeply in the debt of Aristotle for his contributions to logic.